This, this next story pokes a little fun at some of the foibles of married life, because when it comes to humor, there's nothing quite as funny as innocent family interactions. For one reason, is because they're real, and well, we all participate. Remember, for instance, remember the famous Henny Youngman line, "Take my wife, please," which I read was actually a misinterpretation. Henny said that in 1930, an usher in a theater asked if he could escort Henny and his wife to their seats, when in all innocence, Henny let the hilariously iconic line slip out. So that's the first reason. The second reason that stories about married life are so funny is because they're ageless. That same line, "Take my wife, please," would have been just as funny said 2,000 years ago as it is when it's said today. And there's no better way to illustrate that point than with this next story, which is a famous Chinese folk tale that takes place during the Han Dynasty about 200 BC. It's called The Mirror. Once, long ago in China, during the early Han time, there lived a charcoal maker named Wang. Now, Wang was a simple man who lived with his wife and mother-in-law in a little country village not far from a wagon road, where once each month merchants with their wagon train in tow would stop and buy Wang's charcoal and take it to the ironworks in the big city, 2 days' ride from the village. When one day, after a week of torrential rain, the bridge below the village washed out, making it impossible for the wagon train to reach the enclave, and thus unable, at least that month, to pick up Wang's charcoal, which, as it turns out, was actually little more than an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe, since Wang could do what he always did when he first started out, carry his charcoal himself to the ironworks. Besides, he thought, if carrying his charcoal himself would give him a little extra money with which he could buy his wife a gift. And a bonus on top of that, afterward, he could have a look around the city where he hadn't been since he was a little boy. So deciding that's what he'd do, Wang asked his wife what sort of gift she would most like for him to bring back for her. Well, she told him, she'd have to think about that. So she did, and not long after it came to her. "A comb," she said. "Oh, my husband, I would like to bring me a beautiful comb, a comb like the courtiers wear in their hair at the imperial court, a comb shaped just like that." She pointed out the window toward the crescent moon. "A comb shaped just like that." "Very well," Wang agreed. So a few days later, loaded up and ready to go, Wang shouldered his long carrying pole, slung at each end with 2 wide bamboo baskets stacked to the brim with charcoal, and headed down the road toward the big city. Now, although the road was still quite wet, as long as Wang avoided the wagon ruts, the footing wasn't too bad. So after 2 days' walk, he arrived at the ironworks, where he sold his charcoal, stowed his carrying pole and baskets, and with a handful of copper coins in his pockets, set off to explore the big city. Now, as I said, it had been many years since Wang had been to the city. In fact, the last time he was there was when he was a young boy, when he was there with his father, long before the city, there with his father, when he was still a young boy, when the city looked nothing like it does today. What with all of the big buildings that weren't there before, and the throngs of people, and all of the shops, street after shops and stores selling things he'd never seen before, things from all over the world. Why, just the sight of it nearly overwhelmed him. Best of all, however, were those warm, exotic smells that wafted up from the street vendors and sweetmeat shops that proffered the most heavenly food he'd ever seen or tasted. So, sampling one treat after another, Wang spent the day looking into one shop and then another as he wandered around the big city. And thus it went, the classic tale of the country boy, his eyes all agog as if seeing the city for the first time, except that, of course, Wang was not a boy. And although impressed, The simplicity of his life in the country and his charcoal business and providing for his wife was never far from his thoughts. In fact, he proudly said to himself, "Oh my goodness, it's getting late. If I know what's good for me, I better get busy and find a gift for my wife." So in a panic, Wang ducked into the first shop he came to and told the shopmaker that he quick needed to find a suitable gift to return home with his wife. But after a full day of browsing, looking at every type of item imaginable, for the life of him, he couldn't remember what it is she asked him to get for her. So he thought and he thought as he paced around until he happened to look out the shop's front window at the moon. "That's it," Wang cried. "My wife, she told me what she wanted. Look just like the moon." "The moon," Wang cried. "My wife, she told me what she wanted. Look just like the," what was now the full round moon. "Ah," the shopkeeper said, "I know, well then, I know just the thing." So the shopkeeper went over to a display table and brought back a decorative, round, handheld mirror, round, just like the moon that shone outside the shop's front window. "Women love these," he told Wang. Now, Wang, having grown up in the country, had never seen a mirror before, or if he had, he hadn't paid attention, because when he looked into it and saw his reflection, he was taken aback. "Who is that man?" he asked. And after a friendly chuckle, the shopkeeper said, "You must be from the country. I've heard mirrors are a rarity there. So just think, now you'll make your wife a celebrity, the first woman in the village to own one." "Yes, indeed," Wang agreed. So the shopkeeper wrapped the mirror up in a soft white cotton cloth, and Wang slipped it into his satchel, then retrieved his carrying pole and baskets, and set off for home by the light of the full round moon. Now, as you might imagine, the trip home for Wang was made considerably more pleasant without having to carry his heavy load of charcoal. And made even more so when he stepped through the front door of his house, where his wife and mother-in-law had prepared a big feast in honor of his safe return. So after dinner, they all went out onto the front porch, where Wang lit his pipe when his wife asked him, "Husband, do you remember my gift?" "Of course," Wang assured her. Wang assured her as he pulled her present out of his satchel and handed it to her. So like a little girl giggling with excitement, his wife began to meticulously unfold the cotton cloth that the mirror was wrapped in, turning it over and over as she did so, until finally, when just a tiny little bit of the cloth remained, she turned it over for the last time and stared. For just like Wang, she'd never seen a mirror before. And when she saw her reflection, the pleasant, quizzical look that Wang expected to see cross her face was instead anguish, then tears and sobs. "Oh, my husband," she cried unexpectedly, "how could you do this to me? Have I not been a good wife for you, faithful for you, obedient to your every command? And this is how you repay me? Oh, husband, how could you do this to me?" And on she went, making such a ruckus that in a panic, her mother came running out of the house. "Daughter, daughter," she cried, "whatever is the matter? What in the world is going on?" "Wang," she pointed to her husband. "My husband Wang, he's gone to the big city and brought back a new wife for him. Look." So her mother-in-law grabbed the mirror and stared into it herself, and said, "Oh my, it's one thing if Wang brought home a new wife for him, it's true. But if he did, why not someone young and pretty instead of that old hag?" This story is an ancient Chinese folk tale that originated in antiquity. It's called Yúgōng Yíshān, the foolish old man who removed the mountains, in which Yúgōng the affectionate nickname given to the hero of this story, which in Chinese means foolish old man, comes up with the idea that he's going to single-handedly dig up and remove 2 huge mountains in order to shorten the distance he has to travel to get his crops to market. Now, as I said, this is an ancient tale that for millennia was handed down orally from one generation until the next, until the 4th century BC, when it was finally written down by the Taoist philosopher Lao Tzu, then resurfaced in print in modern times when Mao Zedong, the founder of the Chinese Communist Party, included it in his little red book of sayings as a parable praising the virtues of perseverance and hard work, which on one level is indeed what this story is all about. You know, the indomitable will of man and the seemingly impossible things he can accomplish when he puts his mind to it. But there's more to it than that. As you'll see, discover at the end, something unexpected and magical and wonderful, which is why this story has endured for thousands of years. So to begin, let me first give you the lay of the land. There's a mountain range in northern China called the Taihong Mountain Range that lies between the Shanxi Plateau to the north and the Yellow River Plain to the south, which is very much like what we have here. The Shanxi Plateau in China is a lot like eastern Washington. It's sparsely populated for the most part, with small rural towns and ranches and farms. And the Shanxi Plateau in China is a lot like western Washington. There's lots of people who live in big cities, like we do here in Tacoma and Seattle, plus there's lots of business and industry. And in between are mountain ranges, the Taihong Mountain Range in China, and here, the Cascade Mountain Range. And in the old days, the only way to cross these mountain ranges was by foot, since there were no roads, by foot, with perhaps a pack mule or two. Since back then there were no roads, only narrow trails that at least here, trappers and Indians had used for hundreds of years. So since there were no roads, the only way for farmers, for instance, in eastern Washington, to get the apples that they grew there to the people who lived in the big cities here in western Washington, was to take them all the way around the Cascade Mountains down to Portland and then back up, making the trip twice as long. And the same was true of the Taihong Mountains in China. There were no roads, only goat trails. So the only way for the farmers who lived on the north side of the mountains to get the crops they grew there to the people who lived in the big cities on the south side was again to take the long trip around, which was the predicament that the hero of our story, Yúgōng, faced. Oh, and did I mention Yúgōng was 90 years old? 90 years old, and ever since he was a young boy growing up on a farm near the small country village of Yangcheng in China, Yúgōng and his family had to load their crops onto wagons and take them all the way around the mountains in order to sell them at the markets in the big cities of Jingzhou and Zhaiyuan on the other side. When one day Yúgōng said to himself, "For all my life, these mountains have stood in my way, making me take the long way around to sell my crops, twice as long and twice as far than if they were not there." Actually, he had been saying that exact same thing every day since he was 10 years old. And now at 90, he was still saying it. "If only I could remove these mountains, they would no longer be an obstacle. Then not only myself, but all the farmers of Yangcheng would have a shorter way to Zhaiyuan and Jingzhou to sell our crops." If only, the chimeric musings of a Chinese Don Quixote tilting at windmills. How in the world was a foolish old man, before the time of electricity or machinery or even dynamite, going to remove a mountain? Actually, 2 mountains, since the 2 largest peaks in the whole Taihong Range, Mount Wangwu and Mount Wutai, were the ones that stood in his way. But Yúgōng was anything but foolish. He'd been thinking and planning with a clear head for nearly 80 years on how he would remove those 2 mountains, Wangwu and Wutai. And now that he turned 90 years old, he figured the time was just right to put his plan into action. So that night, Yúgōng gathered his family around him and laid out his plan. I couldn't have convinced you when I was younger, Yúgōng began. Nor would it have been right to neglect my family. But now that I am old and you, my son, are largely running the farm, it's time I fulfill my dream of removing these two mountains, Wangwu and Wutai, so that not only we, but all the villages of Yingcheng will have a shorter distance to move our crops and visit our relatives in the big cities on the other side. And tomorrow I will begin. Now, Yúgōng's wife and eldest son knew that Yúgōng was a dogged and determined man. Throughout his life, he completed every project he'd begun, despite setbacks or how long it took. So they knew that even in this impossible task of removing two huge mountains, he couldn't be dissuaded. All I ask, his old wife pleaded, is that you solicit the help of some younger men in the village to help you with this heavy work. Yes, Yúgōng conceded, you are right. Chow, you will be my helper. Okay, Yi, shouted Yúgōng's 12-year-old grandson. Now get to bed. We'll be up with the sun. So the next morning, Yúgōng and Chow loaded all of their picks and shovels into the farm wagon, hooked up to the donkey, and when they reached the base of Mount Wangwu, they began to fill up the farm wagon with earth and rocks. Now, in a small country village like Yingcheng, everyone knew everybody's business. It was as if the walls had ears. No sooner did you whisper a secret in your neighbor's ear than the whole village knows exactly what it is that you'd said. So the next morning, an old Taoist, who everybody in the village regarded as a wise man, came out to see what Yúgōng and Chow were up to. And when he got there, he stood watching for a while, stroking his long gray beard, which is what wise men are supposed to do, of course, then said, Yúgōng, my friend, this morning I heard of your plan to remove Mount Wangwu and Mount Wutai to make it easier to reach the big cities on the other side. So I have come to offer you some advice. Now, if you've ever spent any time around elderly Chinese men, you may have noticed that whenever they give advice, they tend to do so with their hands clasped behind their back, as did the old Taoist when he dispensed his sage wisdom as he continued with his conversation with Yúgōng. Yúgōng, these mountains, they are thousands of feet high and have been here for 100 million years. And you, at your advanced age, have barely the strength left to remove a dunghill. Don't you think you are outmatched? Besides, where do you propose to deposit all the earth and the rock that you will remove from these great mountains? We will take the ancient road around the mountains, as we always have, Yúgōng explained. Then follow the Yellow River to the sea, where we will deposit all the earth and rock that we have removed onto the promontory of Pohai, extending its reach into the sea. Which, upon hearing, the old Taoist burst out laughing. But it is 600 miles to the Yellow Sea, which your donkey cart will take you 2 months to traverse and 2 months more to return. Gone. Good intentions aside, but you are the greatest fool if you cannot see the futility of this endeavor. I beg your pardon, sir, Yúgōng shot back. You are wise, and on paper, your calculations equal out. But your vision is blocked by the very paper you've placed in front of you. For even my young grandson, who has barely learned to add and subtract, can clearly calculate the vast sums that evade your years of learning. For although I must die, and perhaps before this season is even spent, well, if I do, my grandson will carry on with the work. And when he grows up and marries, he will have sons and grandsons who in turn will sire sons and grandsons of their own. Thus, through all this posterity, my line will not die out. While these two mountains, Wangwu and Wutai, as high as they are, will not add even 1 inch to their height. So why should I despair of reveling them to the ground at last? For which the Taoist had no reply. So Yúgōng and Chao went back to work. 3 times each year, filled their donkey cart with earth and rocks. And 3 times each year, they dumped a tiny bit of Mount Wangwu and Mount Wutai into the Yellow Sea. Now, eventually, the novelty surrounding Yúgōng's endeavor began to wane amongst the villagers of Yangcheng, but the work of leveling the 2 mountains continued unabated. Year by bit, year by year, bit by bit, Yúgōng and Chao chipped away at Mount Wangwu and Mount Wutai, lowering its height, which began to affect heaven itself. You see, in Chinese mythology, mountains are regarded as massive pillars that hold up the sky. And the sky, in turn, is where heaven exists and the gods live. So by chipping away at Mount Wangwu and Mount Wutai, lowering its height ever so slightly, the balance of the Yúgōng and Chao were actually affecting the balance of the sky so that heaven was at risk of tilting. And the spirits who lived in those 2 mountains, who through long experience knew how stubborn humans could be, grew concerned that Yúgōng and Chao might succeed. So they entreated the great goddess Meiyuquā to intervene and put a stop to Yúgōng's crusade. So one night, not long after, when Yúgōng and Chao were at home asleep, Meiyuquā sent 2 giants, immortals, down to Yangcheng to remove the mountains themselves and relocate them so as to keep the sky balanced. So when the giants landed, the first one pulled up Mount Wutai and hoisting on its back, took 2 giant steps to the south, spanning 400 miles, and set Mount Wutai back down way south of Yangzhou in Hunan province. While the second giant, with Mount Wangwu on his back, took 3 giant steps to the north and set Mount Wangwu back down way up in the northwest corner of Shanxi province. In the morning, Yúgōng and Chao, who had slept unusually sound that night, stepped out their front door to hook the donkey cart up as usual, when they were assailed by shouts and cheers from a throng of villagers rushing up the path to their house. "Yúgōng, Chao," they shouted, "you've done it! The mountains, they are gone!" And indeed they were. Miraculously, overnight, Mount Wangwu and Mount Wutai, leaving a vast level plain where they once stood, extending all the way from Yangcheng to the big cities of Jingzhou and Zhaiyuan on the other side. And the great goddess Meiyuquā, who was looking down from heaven on this spectacle, was pleased as well. For the sky was still supported by Mount Wangwu and Mount Wutai and their new locations. That is, until the next foolish old man gets a bright idea.
The story I'm going to be telling tonight is Mr. Blackbird and his wife. It's an Indian story from India that may have many different types of morals depending on how you feel. It is a story about a husband and his wife, and a husband who's loved his wife that went on to a quest to save her. It's called Mr. Blackbird and His Wife. In the morning and in the evening, every day, Mr. Blackbird and Mrs. Blackbird would be high up in a tree, and they would be singing. And as they sang, the notes would come down, almost as if it were silver and gold, and would land into your ears. The villagers and the people around loved the sound of Mr. and Mrs. Blackbird and would gather under the tree to listen. The king, in a far-off area, heard about Mr. and Mrs. Blackbird and came to listen to the music that was silver and gold as it landed in your ears. When he arrived one morning, he listened and he told his servants, I want Mr. and Mrs. Blackbird, put them into a cage and take them to my bedroom in the palace so that I may listen to them when they put me to sleep at night and when they wake up in the morning. Well, the servants got busy and they tried to capture Mr. and Mrs. Blackbird. Well, they caught Mrs. Blackbird, put her into a cage, and from there took her off to the palace. They did not capture Mr. Blackbird. Mr. Blackbird became so enraged that the king would have an idea to even take his wife away, that he decided, I'm going to get her back. I am declaring war on the king. So with that, with his resolve, he went to the briar bush and took out and found the longest thorn he could find. He put that into his belt to act as a sword. He took a walnut, broke it in half. With half of it, he put it on his head as a helmet. The other half, he made into a drum. And when he was ready, he started marching down the road to the palace to get his wife back. Rat-a-tat-tat, 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 as he marched stiffly down the road. Well, he came across Mr. Fox. Mr. Blackbird, where are you going? The king has stolen my wife and I'm going to get her back. I have declared war on the king. The fox thought for a moment. I too have aught against the king. I will go to war with you. He chases me with his dogs and does not give me rest, even to my own den. I will declare war on the king with you. The blackbird said, you may come along with me, crawl into my ear, and we will go to war against the king. So the fox crawled into the blackbird's ear. And when he got settled in, the blackbird started marching again. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. As he walked along, he came across a rope that was tied up in knots and thrown to the side of the road. This rope raised up and said, Mr. Blackbird, where are you going? The king has stolen my wife and I have declared war against him. I am going to free my wife and bring her back home. The rope thought for a moment and said, I too have aught against the king. He has used me and tied me up into knots and threw me to the side of the road. I will go to war against the king with you. The blackbird looked at him and said, crawl into my ear and we will go to war. And with that, the rope untangled itself and then crawled into the ear of Mr. Blackbird. He curled himself into a nice coil right next to Mr. Fox. And when they had settled in, Mr. Blackbird started marching again. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. As he marched along, he came across the Queen of Ants. The Queen of Ants looked at him and said, Mr. Blackbird, where are you going? Mr. Blackbird said, I have aught against the king. I've declared war. He's stolen my wife and I'm getting her back. And with that, the queen looked around and said, I too have aught against the king. He poisons my family. He kills off my workers. And I too will go to war with you. Mr. Blackbird said to the Queen of Ants, gather up your hordes, crawl into my ear, and we'll go to war. And with that, the queen got all of her people. They crawled into the ear of the blackbird and curled up into a ball next to the rope, next to the fox. And when they had all settled in, Mr. Blackbird started marching off again. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. Towards the end of day, he came to a bridge over a pond, and the pond raised up and said, Mr. Blackbird, where are you going? The king has stolen my wife. I am going to declared war. I am going to get her back. And with that, the pawn said, I too have aught against the king. He is constantly poisoning my waters. He's constantly soiling the waters. I too will go to war with you. Blackbird said, crawl into my ear. So the pond crawled into his ear and put himself into a pool next to the ball of ants, next to the rope, next to the fox. When all had settled in, he started off to the palace again. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, with as much vigor as when he first started out. Towards evening, he came up to the palace, the big doors, and he beats on the door. A servant opens the door, expecting to see a person there, and what he sees is the blackbird. Blackbird looks at him and says, I have declared war on the king. He's stolen my wife and I want her back. With that, the servant took the blackbird to the king in the chambers. And as the blackbird is talking to the king, I have declared war against you. You stole my wife and I want her back. The king looks at him, and says, I am the king. I can have whatever I want. Blackbird says, I'm declaring war against you. And with that, the king told the servants, take the blackbird, go put him in the chicken pen. Surely he will be dead by morning. They will have killed him. And with that, the servants picked up the blackbird and put him into the chicken coop, closed up the doors. The next morning, the servants went back expecting to get the carcass of the blackbird. Mr. Blackbird, however, during the night, the fox had crawled out of his ear and had terrorized the chickens so much they were all huddling in a corner and they could not move because of the fox. The servants were surprised when Mr. Blackbird was still alive, marching back and forth, beating his drum, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. I have declared war on the king. Well, the servants took him back to the king. The king was so surprised he was still alive. But the king also became angry. The chickens were so terrorized, he had no eggs for breakfast. Later that night, the king said, take the blackbird, put him in with the horses. The horses will trample him to death. So the servants took the prisoner, the blackbird, put him in with the horses. The horses started milling around to check out this blackbird, preparing to trample him. Out of Blackbird's ear, after the doors were closed, came out the rope. The rope became a whip and started slapping at the horses. They went back into their stalls and they did not come out all night. The next morning, the servants expected to see the carcass of the blackbird. However, what did they see? The blackbird marching back and forth. I am at war with the king. I will get my wife back. The servants took the blackbird back to the king. The king once again was surprised. The blackbird is there. I'm at war with you. You release my wife. I'm not going to release her. No. So that night, of course, the king is getting even more angry. Once again, the chickens have not laid any eggs. Now the horses will not come out of their stalls. He cannot ride his horses. Take the blackbird, put him in with the elephants. So the servants did. They took the blackbird, put him in with the elephants, closed up the doors, expecting that the elephants would definitely crush him with their big feet. Well, that night, after the doors were closed and the elephants were coming around to crush the blackbird, the queen ant and all of her family came out of the blackbird's ear and crawled over to the elephants and started tickling them. Tickled them so much that the elephants screamed and cried all night long, thrashing around. The king in his room was thinking, yep, Blackbird's dead for sure this time. Well, in the morning, the servants went to go get the carcass of the blackbird. What did they see? The elephants all in a corner, trembling, ants all over the place, and Mr. Blackbird charging back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, just beating his drum. I am at war with the king. Well, the servants took the blackbird back to the king, who was absolutely dumbfounded. He cannot believe that Blackbird has survived, not only the chickens, but the horses, and now the elephants. Take Blackbird, tie him to my bed. I will find out what the magic is that this blackbird has, and I will take care of him myself. So with that, the servants that night took Blackbird and tied him to the king's bed. Up in a silver cage was Mrs. Blackbird. She had not sung a single note the whole time that she had been put into the cage and taken to the chambers of the king. That night, after the king went to bed, he said, I will stay awake. I will find out what the magic is this blackbird has. Well, he couldn't stay awake. Pretty soon, he went to sleep. That night, as the king slept, he started getting water. The pond had come out of the blackbird's ear and had covered the floor. And then as more and more water came out, it started coming up to the bed and getting the bed sheets wet. The king awoke, soaking wet, cold, water all over. And as the water just kept rising and rising, pretty soon the bed is now moving back and forth, and the king is afraid he's going to drown. He untied Mr. Blackbird. Mr. Blackbird opened the cage. Mr. and Mrs. Blackbird got out to the window, and with that, they left the king. As they flew back during the night with the moon overhead and the stars, they flew back to their tree, and they went high up in the tree. And as the morning dawned, you could hear Mr. and Mrs. Blackbird singing with notes that are so beautiful. It's like silver and gold that falls upon the ear. And the villagers once again came back and started listening as they sang, so that the silver and gold notes of their songs would land in their ears.